in the new Institute of Health. And I'm going to present the findings from the early part of my PhD, where I've just finished an initial study with 6 participants that are adult survivors of childhood domestic abuse. So, it's not time to finish just yet. So the talk's going to take about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. We'll have some time for questions, and then we can grab another drink and just have a little mooch about afterwards. So a little bit about me. One of the jobs that I did for a number of years was work as an independent domestic violence advisor, so worked in the field of domestic violence as a practitioner. So obviously that's where the bulk of my interest has come from. Also over the years, from talking to friends that have had experiences of living with domestic abuse, then when I was starting to think about doing my PhD, I thought I'll have a little look about what's out there, you know, because there's a lot of research that talks about how it impacts on children. There's everything from how it affects children in the womb in terms of increased cortisol, one of the stress hormones, affecting children's behaviour, so that slight developmental delays, etc. And there's research through childhood ages up to kind of later teens, early adulthood, in terms of acting out, in terms of risk-taking behaviours as a means of means of escaping the abuse that happens at home. But when I came to look at what happened once those children had grew up, there's actually very, very little out there. In fact, I've only found half a dozen studies, 4 of which are American and 2 of which are Australian. There doesn't appear to be any UK-based research into this field. So this will be one of the first kind of, the mini study that I've done at the moment is one of the first bits of research that I've been able to find. And a lot of literature that is out there is quite negative. You know, it presupposes that because of a child has experienced those really negative experiences, that automatically means that they're going to have a really negative adulthood. And my research has found some of that, but actually over a longer period of time that seems to right itself again, but we'll get to that. So I'm exactly halfway through my PhD at the moment. I'm due to complete this time in 2 years, September 2021. So I'll be a bit more panicky and sweaty even that night when I'm handing in a great big 80,000 word document. But at the moment I've finished the initial study with 6 participants and I've already started the main study. So I'm carrying on with a wider age range of people. I've got people in their 30s, 40s, 50s. I've got 1 or 2 people in the 60s, 70s at the moment, but I'd like to kind of get increased numbers for that age range if I can, so that I've got a good mix of people. So the study itself comprised 2 different elements. There was an online survey for people to complete, and there was 3 sections to that. There were some background questions about where people lived, what sort of home environment it was, who they lived with, etc. And then there were some questions about their experiences as children, what helped them, what didn't help, etc. And the same sort of questions for them as adults, what stayed with them over time, what's been helpful, what hasn't been helpful. So that was the starting point. So the 6 people complete the questionnaire, and then the questionnaire asked if people wanted to consent to a follow-up interview to allow me to get more in-depth information. So 4 of those 6 consented to give an interview. At the moment with the main study, I'm up to 18 people, and the majority of those have agreed for a follow-up interview. So considering it takes me about an hour to type up 6 minutes of verbal speech, I'm going to be very busy. You won't see me ever again after tonight. So the themes that have come out from the initial study, I've categorised. So within those themes with different elements, but they've banded together into these 7 initial themes. And you can see how many times that those different categories have been mentioned by the participants through the information. So what I'm going to do is go through those one by one, and I'm going to share some of the participants' experiences with you to highlight some of those themes, which I'll do. So the first one, which was about support and social interactions. So a lot of people talked about having a safe space to retreat to as a means of comfort, somewhere to escape to when things were difficult at home and things were kicking off. So typically that might be a grandparent's house, it might be a neighbour's down the street, or it could be a friend's house. Time spent with family and friends was something that people reflected on. Sometimes that was difficult because the nature of the relationship at home, living with domestic abuse, meant that typically the person who was controlling in the home environment controlled people's relationships outside of the home, and that's something that's been found elsewhere in research. So one participant talked about only being able to see her dad and her stepmom once a week, and for her, a couple of the 6, it was the mum in the adult relationship who was the primary person who was the aggressive and parent, so the other 4, it was the father. One participant shared that the absolute worst time for him was family holidays, because then there was no means of escape. It was going away somewhere, you were all stuck together, and that was absolutely the worst time for him, was having enforced time. And again, for him, it was his mother that was the abusive person in the family. One participant talked about being able to have friends. Now, for a lot of people, that was a difficult situation. They could have friends outside of the home, but they couldn't have a reciprocal friendship where you would go to your friend's house and then they would come back to yours. For typical, for understandable reasons, because it wasn't safe, it wasn't encouraged, or it was flat out disallowed by the parents. But one participant talked about going for tea one night at a fairly new friend's house. And she said when she went into the house, she was quite struck because it seemed very light and airy, and the more she thought about it, she reflected that actually when she used to go into her own family home, she had this instant choked up feeling, and that was just such a natural occurrence that she never really realised up until that point, going into a different family, that was not the normal situation. So she said, I remember it was like being struck over the head with something. She said it was that dramatic, that people were actually sitting down and talking to each other and asking what their day was like. She said that was the moment for her, aged about 11 I think, where she really realised that actually my upbringing is not typical, because what children generally do is they normalise their experience. Another participant reflecting about what he considered to be real friendship, if I put my glasses on I can tell you, said, I divided my relationships into 2 categories. Family aside, I would have close friends. After that, everyone else would be considered associates. In that sense, I would expect a face level of loyalty from close friends, the kind of loyalty where you would take a bullet from me and vice versa, asking questions later. I had no space for casual friendships, mentally speaking. Therefore, even though I had positive relationships with the vast majority of people, I only had a handful of real friends. So the next category, which was about dealing with feelings and emotions, understandably it was quite a typical feeling to feel isolated and lonely and withdrawn or vulnerable. Again, one participant shared, I remember my mum throwing a tricycle at my head. I remember this one only because the same day a social worker was visiting. Once the social worker had arrived, I ran up to him and told him what was happening. But the response that followed after the social worker left was concerning. My dad had a massive argument with my mum, and again for this participant it was the mum that was abusive. So following on from this, just as I was thinking that he had stuck up for me, He hurried into my room and he simply said, "Don't ever tell the social worker something like that again." I guess this was maybe his idea of avoiding me being taken into care. But for me though, it was a moment that I realised, even at that young age, that I'm going to have to do this whole life thing alone. At that stage, I lost the ability to easily build trust with others, and I think he was only about 7 or 8 at that time when that happened, so that's a pretty sad state of affairs. But participants also talked about how living in an abusive situation, typically you develop extra kind of response systems, so you're trying to anticipate risks before they happen, so you're very tuned into what's happening around you. So some people talked about that sense of intuition. I believe I am quite intuitive with people's feelings and needs. I spent years of my life trying to interpret early signs and reading body language, and as a result I can get quite intense gut feelings in reading situations. I am able to intensively reflect on experiences and feelings, which has been useful as well as detrimental. So sometimes it can be useful, that skill, but sometimes it can be detrimental because it's hard to switch that off when that's been your way of living and being, is to always suss out a situation and trying to work out what mood somebody's in. That can sometimes tip over into not being helpful. So the next category was dealing with the impact of domestic abuse. So again, what literature there is about children, often, as well as presupposing that, it presupposes that children are actually quite passive, you know, that thought of children are kind of sitting in the corner, maybe watching what's going on, or maybe hearing something in a different room. Actually, what this research has found out is that children are every bit involved in what's going on, sadly in a negative way, in terms of receiving abuse. So every category of abuse that typically you would think of the victim in the adult relationship receiving, in terms of, well, as you see, emotional, sexual abuse, physical abuse, controlling and coercive behaviour, that's all displayed actively with the children. In terms of coercive control, we've talked a little bit about limiting contact with people outside of the home, in terms of minimising the opportunity for somebody to get involved and find out what was happening within the house. One participant, you know, received quite severe sexual abuse over a number of years from her father, who was also the abusive one to the mother. And she talked about the abuse being so pervasive and all-encompassing that sometimes she wondered how she survived at all. Ongoing contact with the abusive parent, so that's something that all 6 people reflected upon in terms of, as an adult, how have they gone forward to have contact with the parents, you know, once they've established that adult relationship. For 3 of the participants, they've chosen to have ongoing contact with both parents, but they very much limit it. So they limit the contact in order to feel a better sense of equilibrium. So one woman talked about, you know, she could have contact with a mum who was the abusive one, especially emotionally abusive and controlling. But if a mum popped out, you know, popped into the middle of town and went into a shop where she was and she wasn't expecting to see her, that could have really still quite negative impact on her. But she, you know, on a normal situation when she expected to see her maybe one Sunday in the month, she could gear herself up for it and she could be prepared for that, and she felt more in control of that situation. So 3 out of the 6 had some ongoing contact but limited. For 2 of the participants, they spoke about the abusive parent who'd actually died since they'd become an adult. Both of which had had some opportunity as an adult to sit down with the abusive parent and speak to them about their experiences and have some opportunity to say how it had impacted on them, which they felt had been really positive in helping them to move forward. One participant, because of the nature of the abuse, had just cut off contact altogether with both of his parents, so he had no ongoing contact at all. In terms of role reversal, what's sometimes referred to as the Cinderella effect. So one participant in particular talked about the fact that when her dad remarried, she ended up with lots of kind of half siblings, and it was very much part of the control of that household was that she had to take responsibility for the caretaking for her younger siblings. She had to do most of the housework, the domestic chores, and she described she was really into school as well, and she was really highly intelligent, but she spoke about having to sit up to the small hours once her Cinderella duties had finished to be able to complete her homework. So that was pretty difficult. Another participant said, I ended up having to grow up pretty quick. I always felt like I was responsible for me and I couldn't depend on my parents. And I felt that the roles had totally reversed by the time I got to the age of 9 or 10. Physical abuse that some participants had experienced, just one incident, and the participant was only aged 3, said he recalled his mum knocking his head against the concrete repeatedly, ending off with a pair of scissors to his head. And he talked about the fact that every time he's at the barber's, barber will, typically say, oh, how did you get that, mate, and that's something that continually kind of is brought back to life. It's something, he sees it every day when he looks in the mirror. So that's difficult for him to forget. So the next category was about coping mechanisms. One participant in particular talked about writing. So she would write her feelings out, but she said she kept a red diary and she wrote really vicious poetry in it. So she fictionalised everything that was happening in the home. And it was a means for her of escape. And she kept it hidden under her bed so that if it was ever found, but she was comfortable enough that if it was ever found, she could pass it off because it was kind of fictional writing, but that's how she got her release. Some other people talked about how reading and access to music was really important. I would read constantly, always having a book, my head in a book, and immersing myself in fictional worlds. Music was my main love. I would shut myself away and listen to music for hours, something that still gives me comfort today. Self-harming seems a little bit strange on the outside of it, but some people had taken control by self-harming. And if that's your only means of control as a child, then it's a pretty limited experience. I self-harmed as a teenager. I reached a point at age 14 where I just felt permanently exhausted and numb, and I hurt myself in order to feel something. Counselling and self-help, so this is kind of reaching more mature years. I believe that therapeutic intervention is necessary for people to understand their life and how they can work through this and to move forward. Drug and alcohol addiction, for some people, I started using drugs and alcohol as a teenager in my bid to escape the reality of what was going on at home. I was emotionally troubled by my teenage years, filled with anger and shame. By the time I was 21, I was a full-blown heroin addict. The road has been perilous and long, but I've been clean for 10 years now. I still have some demons, but life on the whole is okay. So the next category was about other influencing factors. So some talked about the fact that at some point their parents had divorced or separated. One participant shared, I had a very mixed childhood. My parents split when I was 1 year old, and I lived with my single parent mum until she remarried. I spent a lot of my childhood moving around, being looked after by maternal grandparents, but seeing my dad on a weekly basis. Not unusually, they talked about the nature of the domestic abuse between the parents. One participant said that whilst her parents were together, she remembers never wanting to be home. There were always rows and fights, mainly my dad, verbally, emotionally and physically abusing my mum. We were poor as my dad would drink and gamble and take this out on my mum. I didn't feel safe at home, even though my dad didn't hit the children, but I felt helpless and hopeless witnessing my mum going through what she did. For some, school was a means of release. So one participant talked about their thirst for knowledge and creative play, which was never nurtured at home, and that was something that they got from the school environment. The home, that there was no books in the house, nothing to spark off their imagination. And one participant in particular who really struggled even as a young adult, you know, when she was of age to be able to leave home, but she felt the only way that got some legitimacy was when she applied to go to university, and that was the way that she legitimised her escape from the family home. I've touched on briefly that 2 of the 6 participants, their parent had died. One participant said that, you know, although her dad had been pretty abusive to her, that she persisted by sending Christmas cards and birthday cards, and that it was a way just of her kind of saying, I'm still here, I haven't disappeared under a rock, you know, you haven't crushed me. It was just a way of her kind of stating her presence in the world that she felt was really important. So the last couple of categories now. This one, which was about self-concept. So typically talk about themselves as a child. You would expect maybe that some would have described themselves as shy, scared, introverted, which absolutely some did. But also some of the participants described themselves as curious children, quite spirited. And this quote from one of the participants talked about having to squash that side of her personality. Because when you grow up in that environment, or you experience those things, being you is just worthless. It's not worth anything. You're just a shell in that environment, and you're just empty. So there is no you to love, really. Because you don't know who you are. You just try to survive it. Because the person who I am now is strong, if I was strong then, I wouldn't have survived that, because it would have just been conflict all the time. So that part of me, I just had to put it away. Or the part of me that wanted happiness, that didn't exist then, because I'd never had it. I had to create it for myself, but I couldn't create it in that environment. I thought that was quite insightful, that even as a child, she was knowledgeable enough to suppress that side of her personality, because you knew it would have been an extra risk factor. The last category then, which was acts of defiance. So some sought opportunities when they presented, the few and far between, to get some kind of measure back of control. One talked about she had a bit of an on-off relationship with her stepmom after her dad remarried, but on occasion when the stepmom was, you know, trying to be nice, that she would ask her for advice for hair and makeup, and, you know, ask her to help her get made up for a night out. And she said she would deliberately kind of make her up to look like a bit of a fright. And kind of say, oh God, you look absolutely fantastic, you know. And she got some sense of kind of, you know, control back by knowing that she'd sent her out for a night out looking like a bit of an awful fright, which I thought was quite funny. One participant who talked about when things were going on at home, he would swear really disgusting, foul language, but just under his breath so that he wasn't found out. But he said it really helped him at the time to maintain a sense of himself and to gain some control in the situation, that was a form of release for him. Disclosing the abuse, so the woman who talked about legitimising her escape from the family home by going away to university and moving away for that reason. She felt safe once she was in the university setting to be able to whistleblow. She'd been the participant who'd experienced the sexual abuse, and although it had stopped by that period, once she left the house and she wasn't sure what was going on, she felt that she needed to whistleblow then, because she had younger siblings at home, and the police and social services got involved, and that's a whole other story. Challenging the abusive parent. Some people, on occasion, had enough courage to be able to challenge the abuse and call it out for what it was with the parent. and on occasion the participant who received quite a high amount of physical abuse, he talked about you know, needing to defend himself sometimes, that the abuse was that persistent. So I think for me, one of the surprising things about my research, even though 6 people is not that many, as I say, I've got more participants now and I'm carrying on with the main study, and we'll find out what happens once I've concluded that. But I would have expected more mixed kind of responses. So whilst there does appear to be kind of a 3-stage process, from a really negative childhood, a middle process of really negative kind of after effects. So we heard about, you know, the person with serious drug and alcohol addiction. Other people talked about how it impacted on their mental health, etc. Quite a few of the participants talked about early adult relationships being abusive in terms of them being a victim. So there's this middle aftermath period. But then there seems to be some kind of catalyst for change that happens. For one of the participants, it was when she had her own child, and that made her think about changing for the better. Another participant, actually I'm jumping ahead a little bit. If I say that, so this the start, the middle and the end period, this 3-phase, one participant described themselves at the start of the journey before change was engaged in, and they described themselves or their experiences as being too painful to reflect at that time. They were just emotionally raw. They described themselves like being a raw nerve all the time, that everything hurt. But this middle period, one participant talked about, until you're ready to deal with change, you won't manage it. Until you've hit rock bottom, I think, you won't pick yourself back up. You won't think, well, I don't want this life anymore. Unless you want it and you're ready to do it, then you won't be able to. And that's what's changed for me. That's what's got me out of the hole. Another participant said, there does feel like a before and after person, that there was a very definitive moment in all of it where I thought, I can't play this game anymore and I've got to do something about it to change. So whatever that catalyst is about, and then there seems to be this period after the catalyst where there might be a little bit of slipping back into kind of negative behaviours. Sorry. So another participant described this middle bit as a period of wobbliness and fragility that went on for a long time. But through that fragility, I was always striving to get better, to feel better, to understand, to move on, because it felt for a while that I kept falling apart, and things would be okay, and it would come back and haunt me. But I'd fall apart again, and that went on for a while, and it could have broken me, I suppose, but I kept striving to change. Until in the end, get into a more positive place where they feel like they have overcome, they haven't just been defined by their early childhood experiences. And the quote I'd like to end on from a participant is, I kept facing my demons until I found ways to evolve them into learning, strength and understanding. I have a beautiful, healthy relationship, I've had a really successful career, and I absolutely don't believe that people with difficult childhoods will automatically become hopeless adults with crappy lives and miserable ever afters. So that is the end. So as I say, I'm carrying on with the main study at the moment. If anybody wants any more information about that, or would like to discuss any aspect of it, I've left a bit of paper with a pen on where you can write some contact details on when you go. But just want to open it in case anybody's got any questions about anything I've touched upon. And I can breathe. Yeah.
Hi. It's generally felt in society that there's like a cycle of abusive relationships, going from generation to one generation to another. And when you interviewed your participants, did any of them have any knowledge or mention about the parent, the abusive parent, and whether they'd had abusive experiences in their life as children.
Some people that mentioned it said that though there were some knowledge about that, maybe the abusive parent had received some abuse maybe as a child, or they'd grow up in a chaotic household, but not for everybody. It was probably less than half, definitely. So it's not a given.
No.
But even in this research, most of the participants said to me, if you'd have talked to me 5 years ago or 10 years ago, my story would have been totally different, because they were still in this middle period of aftermath. And within that, some of their early relationships were a bit abusive themselves, because they were playing out the same kind of drama that they'd seen as children. But it's with later adult life and more cognition about what's going on that change has been able to happen. So I'm interested to see, now we've got more participants, about how that's borne out, because a lot of the research might just be stuck in that middle bit of people continuing the cycle, but that maybe doesn't last forever. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to find out. Any other questions?
You're right, I think there hasn't been much research done in the UK. Do you think it's probably more focused on addiction and the coping strategies more so than actually the abuse itself in their childhood? So why do you think there's not research?
I don't know. I mean, there's just been not very much research at all, worldwide even. There's been a half a dozen studies. Only one of those looks at adult male children even. One of them is more specific. It only looks at female adult children and female adult victims. So there's very, very limited research. And I don't know, adverse childhood experience is very popular as a concept, and it's absolutely got its strengths as a model, but no one model can predict every child's experiences. And I think sometimes, too often, we get stuck in that negative trajectory of bad start is going to make a bad end, you know, and we don't unpick it enough, which I think, you know, the little bit of research here is starting to unpick that a little bit and show that actually there can be a different narrative that comes through. So I don't know why, but hopefully we can get the ball moving. Yes, Hilary.
How are you getting your additional participants?
Well, I'm getting them from the publicity that I didn't start by saying that this talk is a replication of a talk I gave in Oslo. Balance, they felt that it really enhanced their relationships in adulthood, that ability to be empathic, deeply empathic with another person was a really positive thing on balance, yeah. Yes.
Do you have any sense that abuse is getting less generally? Because I'm thinking, you know, I've listened to lots of people in my generation who've experienced childhood abuse. They've often said something like, it was just normal. You know, every kid on the estate had similar experiences. So I'm wondering, now that it's named and recognised, do you think it's getting less, or do you not have any sense of that? I suppose you'd like to think that it's getting less. It's certainly getting talked about more, and that's got to be a good thing. But I'm not sure I would feel qualified to say whether it was actually lessening in society. I think it's certainly rising in terms of reporting, but that's probably with the development of more specialist services, you know, that's a natural part of, you know, it seems like things are increasing sometimes, maybe when they're not. But as to the absolute reality, I wouldn't be quite qualified to say, but interesting question. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to ask a question around, you know, because 6 people, it's not a great,
it's not a massive
great
amount,
number,
no.
is it? And at what point does that become, I don't know what I'm trying to say, how to word it.
Representative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. At what point, you know, would your research become, well, this is, you know, the Angie Boyle theory, we don't need to follow that kind of thing.
Got people who've done theories on a lot lesson 6, I can tell you, from what I've read. So 6 is quite chunky. People have done whole PhDs on lesson 6 participants. So I've been told quite a lot that I'm being far too optimistic and that I'm recruiting too many people, but nobody's going to tell me that I can't do it, and I'm going to do it. So,
So I used to work for children's services a couple of years ago, and kind of in 55% of all the child protection cases, the domestic abuse was cited.
yeah,
So,
it's a huge social issue, isn't it?
Just in the people that you know about.
Yes,
really.
absolutely. And it's still going to be a massively underreported for lots of reasons, you know, that we would know about, really. So yes, I agree, 6 isn't a lot, but it's more than some. But I hope to, in the main study, my idea is to have a good chunk of people in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you know, wherever possible I can get, in order to be more test out really what these early findings are. They may not be borne out. I mean, I've had some of the information in already, and it's pretty much of a muchness so far. But I won't absolutely know until I'm further down the path. And you have to come back for the update. Yeah. You can sign up for the update. Yeah. I think there's a question over here. Yeah, Tracy.
Yeah, but you've given me another one actually. I made a note here that we absolutely will have a discussion around why you may not have too many people.
This is one of my supervisors, so.
We kind of want that.
Right.
We want that depth of story really. But we'll have a discussion about another day. I was just picking up some of what you were saying, some of the narratives about the links to poverty.
Yes.
And obviously we're well aware that poverty is still a massive issue, even more so with austerity that we've been experiencing and with the uncertainty around Brexit. Did you get a feel from the 6 that you've spoken to in depth, how many of them actually felt that some of the troubles within their family, whether it was the mother or the father or a combination or whatever, was a result of poverty? How much did that play with
I
you?
think the interesting thing for me is that sometimes the research has just been very limited in its focus, so it's been very silo-focused. So they've looked at domestic abuse in depth, but they haven't looked at wider environmental factors that would exacerbate or ameliorate the situation. So I don't think that's been looked at enough in tandem. So some absolutely talked about, poverty in their childhood, from living in quite, difficult, dirty, unstable kind of housing, moving around a lot. And they've absolutely felt that that made the situation worse because it was an extra pressure. And why wouldn't it be an extra kind of duress? But yes, I would say that not enough research has linked those different parts together, really. That they've either looked at poverty and the reasons for that, or they've looked at domestic abuse, but they haven't necessarily looked at the two things together. Very little research, for example, hasn't looked at the nature of children's relationships with step-parents that have been around. And in my research, there's been really good step-parents that have every bit made positive differences, and there's been really bad step-parents that have made an already difficult situation a lot worse. So I think there's lots of variable factors that need to be looked at as a more holistic kind of research approach. Yeah.
Thank you. Jenna, I think we'll discuss it a bit more in as well. But yeah, thank you.
Just an observation, really. I think listening to you and the experience I've had with people is it really does demonstrate the resilience of people, particularly as life goes on.
Yes, I think that's one of the interesting things.
Humanity, people survive because they end up being resilient.
And there's that need to propel yourself forward. There does seem to be some age-related, experience-related issue. And as I say, independently, a number of the participants said, if you talk to me several years recently at the 3rd European Conference on Domestic Abuse. So it felt important for me because it is such an important topic and it's not something that's really been touched on much, to open it out to a wider audience rather than just replicate it to other specialists in the field. So that's why today's happening. So remind me of the question again.
How are you getting your participants?
So from some of the publicity that's gone on, because there's been a couple of interviews and it's been in the press about, the recent conference, people have just come on board so far. So it's not been too difficult to find participants. in a similar fashion, when I've been to, because I've done a number of conferences and seminars and talks in the past, and every time I've done that, somebody's contacted me afterwards and said, that's absolutely been my experience, and I've never read it anywhere, I've never been able to find anything about it, I've scrabbled around, I've not been able to, share my experiences, and people have volunteered. So it does seem to be like the lid's lifting off something, because there seems to be, without very much effort at all, people coming forward.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yes, Adrina.
I really like the idea of the finely developed intuition, and you talked about that could be both a strength and a limitation with your child. You'd wonder if it's maybe a more protective factor as people go through the lifespan.
And I think on balance, that's what people felt, that it was a positive thing on balance. That sometimes it could tip over a bit in terms of being too oversensitive and not being able to shut yourself off from kind of risk spotting everywhere you are. But on balance, they felt that it really enhanced their relationships in adulthood, that ability to be empathic, deeply empathic with another person was a really positive thing on balance, Yes.
Do you have any sense that abuse is getting less generally? Because I'm thinking, I've listened to lots of people in my generation who've experienced childhood abuse. They've often said something like, it was just normal. Every kid on the estate had similar experiences. So I'm wondering, now that it's named and recognised, do you think it's getting less, or do you not have any sense of that? I suppose you'd like to think that it's getting less. It's certainly getting talked about more, and that's got to be a good thing. But I'm not sure I would feel qualified to say whether it was actually lessening in society. I think it's certainly rising in terms of reporting, but that's probably with the development of more specialist services, that's a natural part of, it seems like things are increasing sometimes, maybe when they're not. But as to the absolute reality, I wouldn't be quite qualified to say, but interesting question. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to ask a question around, because 6 people, it's not a great,
it's not a massive
great
amount,
number,
no.
is it? And at what point does that become, I don't know what I'm trying to say, how to word it.
Representative.
Yeah. At what point, would your research become, well, this is, the Angie Boyle theory, we don't need to follow that kind of thing.
Got people who've done theories on a lot lesson 6, I can tell you, from what I've read. So 6 is quite chunky. People have done whole PhDs on lesson 6 participants. So I've been told quite a lot that I'm being far too optimistic and that I'm recruiting too many people, but nobody's going to tell me that I can't do it, and I'm going to do it.
So I used to work for children's services a couple of years ago, and kind of in 55% of all the child protection cases, the domestic abuse was cited.
It's a huge social issue, isn't it?
Just in the people that you know about.
Yes,
really.
absolutely. And it's still going to be a massively underreported for lots of reasons, that we would know about, really. So yes, I agree, 6 isn't a lot, but it's more than some. But I hope to, in the main study, my idea is to have a good chunk of people in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, wherever possible I can get, in order to be more test out really what these early findings are. They may not be borne out. I mean, I've had some of the information in already, and it's pretty much of a muchness so far. But I won't absolutely know until I'm further down the path. And you have to come back for the update. Yeah. You can sign up for the update. Yeah. I think there's a question over here. Yeah, Tracy.
But you've given me another one actually. I just have made a note here that we absolutely will have a discussion around why you may not have too many people.
This is one of my supervisors, so.
We kind of want that.
Right.
We want that depth of story, really. But we'll have a discussion about another day. I was just picking up some of what you were saying, some of the narratives about the links to poverty.
Yes.
And obviously we're well aware that poverty is still a massive, massive issue, even more so with austerity that we've been experiencing and with the uncertainty around Brexit. Did you get a feel from the 6 that you've spoken to in depth, how many of them actually felt that some of the troubles within their family, whether it was the mother or the father or a combination, whatever, was a result of poverty? How much did that play with
I
you?
think the interesting thing for me is that sometimes the research has just been very limited in its focus, so it's been very silo-focused. So they've looked at domestic abuse in depth, but they haven't looked at wider environmental factors that would exacerbate or ameliorate the situation. So I don't think that's been looked at enough in tandem. So some absolutely talked about, poverty in their childhood, from living in quite, difficult, dirty, unstable kind of housing, moving around a lot. And they've absolutely felt that that made the situation worse because it was an extra pressure. And why wouldn't it be an extra kind of duress? But yes, I would say that not enough research has linked those different parts together, really. That they've either looked at poverty and the reasons for that, or they've looked at domestic abuse, but they haven't necessarily looked at the two things together. Very little research, for example, hasn't looked at the nature of children's relationships with step-parents that have been around. And in my research, there's been really good step-parents that have every bit made positive differences, and there's been really bad step-parents that have made an already difficult situation a lot worse. So I think there's lots of variable factors that need to be looked at as a more holistic kind of research approach. Yeah.
Thank you. Jenna, I think we'll discuss it a bit more in as well. But yeah, thank you.
Just an observation, really. I think listening to you and the experience I've had with people is it really does demonstrate the resilience of people, particularly as life goes on.
Yes, I think that's one of the interesting things.
Humanity, people survive because they end up being resilient.
And there's that need to propel yourself forward. There does seem to be some age-related, experience-related issue. And as I say, independently, a number of the participants said if you talked to me several years ago, you would have had a very different, very negative opinion of what my life was and had amounted to, because I was still stuck in that part and I hadn't got to this bit yet. So I think that's going to be interesting to see if that's borne out again with more people coming forward. Any more questions? Mark?
Angie, that was really fantastic to hear. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark.
I would like to know, what would your main objective be for carrying out this study?
Well, I had all sorts of very complicated things. I wanted to do this, I wanted to do that, I wanted to have the biggest study in the world and cover gender and cover diversity and this, that and the other. And I've absolutely, believe it or not, pared it down over time. And the story that really needs to be told is just people's stories that have lived with this as children and are now in a later adult stage. And I'm saying later, over the age of 30, God, I've just turned 51, so I'm not saying like really old people. It's just that hasn't really, those stories haven't really been told. So for me, whether it's a positive outcome or a less positive outcome or somewhere in between, that's the most pressing thing for me, is just being able to shine a light on this that hasn't really had much attention in the past. And I think that's probably a good place to finish, so that we can get another glass of wine or something on the way out. So thanks again very much for giving up your evening.